Good evening. Welcome to Dreamland Storytelling. Yes. My name is Bonnie Levison, and I am so happy to be here. I was just talking to Josh Gray, who came out before, who is the head of, I can't get his title straight. Is it creative programming? Director of Creative, I just call him the Poobah, because he does everything. He's amazing, and thank you, Josh, for helping us, for supporting this program. Hopefully you know what you're here for. This is Dreamland Storytelling. I believe Cinderella is downstairs. So if you have to go, it's a very different kind of story. This is an evening of true personal stories told without notes. And we have 5 wonderful storytellers who have stepped up to share with you an experience from their life. And what I'm hoping that you're going to experience is this incredible thing that happens with the simple act of sharing a story from your life, which is human connection. And when a story is really well told, it means that we are sharing human emotions and we are all the same inside. And so when you hear these stories, I have a feeling you're going to start thinking about things that happened in your own lives. And I hope that happens. I've shared this before, but the first time I went to a storytelling show, I'm like, storytelling, doesn't that sound like something you do with the children in circle time or in the library? And I went to a show in New York, and 10 strangers got up and shared stories, and suddenly I was talking to everyone around me. And I thought, I gotta have more of this. This is so much fun. It was the best entertainment I'd ever been to, just sharing a story. So that's what you're going to get tonight. And this, as I was talking to Josh, is our 6th storytelling show, we think. We started in 2019, right before COVID. I don't know, has anybody been to one of these shows by hands raised? Oh, great. Well, welcome back. So you know what you're in for. You might have to tell your neighbors what they're doing, what's going to happen. How about who's, by round of applause, first time? Okay, it's a very tepid response, a little nervous. Yes, we do pull you from the audience and ask you all about your life, yes. No, we do not. You are safe in the audience. I think you're going to have a good time. It's just going to be a wonderful evening. Now, you've all, as I said, you're going to hear 5 storytellers. And I just wanted to share, we started in this studio when it was pre-COVID, and then COVID happened. And happily, we continued this program, and we live streamed it from the main theater downstairs. We recorded it. We found ways to keep it going, and it's just been a program that we've been producing in the off season. And it's a wonderful way to, you think about Nantucket in the off season. This place is full, by the way. This is incredible. Thank you all so much for showing up on this cold but beautiful February day. So, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to talk to you a little bit, and then one by one, we're going to have each of the storytellers get up. I'm going to share, as you guys, many of you did, thank you so much for filling out our audience question that are anonymous, but if somebody feels emotional about their answer, they can leap to their feet and say that was mine. I will be reading them. Have at it. But the question that you were asked was, tell us about a time you were surprised. And the reason we decided to ask this question is because the theme of tonight is great expectations. And when you think about stories from your life that involve great expectations, perhaps it's most of your stories when you think about it. In a well-told story, there's always an expectation. There's always a want. And when you think about stories that are well told, there's always a story arc. And this idea that somehow in the beginning of your story, you're in one place, something meaningful happens in your life, and at the end of your story, somehow your perspective or something huge in your life is different. And I think you're going to hear that from all 5 of these storytellers. So I'm excited for you to do that. When I was thinking about something that surprised me, because I don't just make my audience do it, I have to do it too, I was thinking about this time. I am divorced, and I had not dated at all. I went to all girls schools. I went to a mostly girls college. I graduated, and I met my husband. And then suddenly I was divorced, and I was going out on these dates, these blind dates, and I remember meeting this one guy, and he was really cute, to my shock. And we had a lovely drink, and then texting was new in those days. And so he texted me and he said, would you like to have dinner and go and see this movie? I don't remember the name of the movie, name the movie. And I texted him back and I said, that sounds great, but I've already seen the movie. Do you mind if we see another one instead? All good. I go into a meeting. About 2 hours later, I emerge and I look at my phone and he's given me these very odd responses. I'm thinking, is he drinking? What is going on? Because it's things like, I'm not sure I understand. Are you sure? And I like these strange short, what? Question mark, question mark. I'm like, what's wrong with him? Maybe this guy is not as cute as I thought. So I went back, I'm like, what? I just wanted to see a different movie instead. Is that annoying? I do not know. So I go back and I read my text. And as I read it, I see that autocorrect has gotten involved. Something I never knew about, as you all probably know what I'm talking about. So my message, which was, that sounds great, but I've seen that movie, could we see another one instead, was changed to, that sounds great, I've seen that movie, do you mind if we see another one in bed? Okay, this lady just said that was my subconscious. And I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, how did this happen? And how do you get out of that, right? Do you say to someone, oh, I didn't mean that. It was autocorrect. There is no proof of autocorrect. Needless to say, we did not see each other again. It was way too awkward, and I was wildly surprised by that. So, my gift to you as an audience is to check your texts at all times, because autocorrect will screw you one of these days. And so what I'm going to do is, between the stories, we're going to read some of your answers. And oh my goodness, they're so much fun. You guys have worked very hard. One of the greatest things about my job is that I make everyone else do the work. It's the best thing. I make the storytellers do the work. I make you all do the work. It's so much fun. So I'd love to share, and they will be anonymous unless you, as I said, want to take credit for them. But something that I have to laugh about, I think we got 5 of these when I was given this piece of paper, was a time I was surprised. They did not think they had to participate. So let's read a few of these. Let's see. Oh, here we are. 2 weeks after he went on a blind date, I asked the lady to marry me. She said yes. It scared me, we're just going to say it, shitless. It scared me shitless. And that was 55 and a half years ago. How great is that? And I love that he put in the half, by the way. 55 and a half, not 55, not 60. I mean, 56, yeah. Okay. I like this. Tell us about a time you were surprised getting water in a can. I kind of agree with that. Here's a lovely one. I'm surprised every morning when I wake up. Now, I don't know if it's because you've got a beautiful view or because you're alive, but I'm just going with joy. I'm going with joy. Oh my gosh. And and we're going to get some serious ones too. I was surprised when I was told I lost my housing. Yeah. And here's a great one. Time I was surprised was when I ran for elected office and won. Like, what a thought that you were surprised by that? That's so interesting. That is what's called not an optimist. I think that's a pessimist. I'm going to run for office and lose. What? I won? Okay, we're going to get this show going, and I know you're going to just give all our storytellers so much love, because it's kind of a scary thing to do, to put your soul out there right here on this rug in this studio in front of all these people, most of whom they do not know. But I have asked each of our storytellers to share an early memory from Nantucket. And I'll tell you a little bit about them afterwards, but the only thing I'm going to share with you is this early memory that they shared with me and their name. And so, and then they will come up to the stage. And I know for our first storyteller, you're going to give her a lot of love because she's going first, and that's not easy. So our first storyteller, when asked what's an early memory, she was in college. She came to Nantucket for the first time, and she was on Surfside Beach. And she writes, "I just remember the feeling of standing there on that empty beach, facing this huge expanse of water, and I was cocooned in this light, the quality of which was so warm and golden, it was amazing to me. And I felt a presence there, almost like I was with another person, like Nantucket was a person. And I felt in that moment, paradoxically, both held and free at the same time." Please welcome Michelle Whalen.
Hi, everybody. So my dad was a cheapskate, or as some people like to call it, thrifty. This was a man who, despite the fact that he had the resources to send each of his 9 children to, of which I was the youngest, by the way, to 12 years of private Catholic school, refused to air condition his home in the summertime, to drive the back roads for the sake of beauty because that used up too much gas, to pay for family entertainment because that was simply frivolous. A good example of this would be when we were kids, everyone, and I do mean everyone, had cable TV. Did we have cable TV? Not exactly. We had the ability to see certain channels like HBO or MTV, but that was merely because my brother had happened to find a cable behind the sofa one day and just decided to hook it up. So if we turned the dial, that's right, I said dial, because my father didn't think that a television with buttons, having only been around for 30 plus years, that it was time to invest in one. So when we turned the bottom dial, the regular channel images would fade out, and we would go through a land of fuzz and fizz, and then the mysterious images from the netherworld of cable would show up. So I didn't really understand how all this worked, but I didn't question it until one day the doorbell rang, and there was a cable technician standing there. And I heard my father greet him abruptly, which is how he greeted anyone he didn't know who came to the door, with the suspicion that they were there to con him, or at the very least to sell him something that he did not want. And then I heard the cable guy say to my dad, in a somewhat haughty tone, that he believed we should be paying for cable as there was a live cable connected to our home. Whereupon my father told him in no uncertain terms that he would not be paying for cable, not now and not ever, because we didn't care for cable. He had never asked for cable to be put into our home, and he just felt like Comcast could take cable away at any time. So then the thoroughly cowed technician went away, and we never heard from him or Comcast again. And we just kept watching our stolen cable. So that was not the first time, though, that the doorbell rang out of the blue, and I was thrown for a loop by the way my dad responded. When I was about 10 years old, we moved away from my home state of New Jersey to a small town outside of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And in this vast rural area, the closest Catholic school was about 45 minutes away by a combination of bus and car. Undaunted by this distance, my parents enrolled us anyway. So, needless to say, I was completely taken aback and surprised, so bewildered, when the doorbell rang one day, Saturday afternoon, and I opened it to find my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Folk, standing on the doorstep. So my father came to the door almost immediately, and having never met my teacher before, because he was so busy providing for us that he didn't pay any attention to us. So he got to the door, and he said, "Who are you and what do you want?" I was so painfully embarrassed. And Mrs. Folk, of course, hurrying to explain that she was my teacher, he then didn't invite her in. he just turned to me and sent me upstairs. So I hid on the landing, of course. I didn't get very far. I was just behind the banister, and I heard everything as my teacher explained that she had recently given us an assignment in English class, that we were supposed to write a mythological story, and that I had written a story that she'd, in all her years of teaching, she had never read the like from a fifth grader. She was just amazed by the language and the character development and the plot. She loved how whimsical and creative it was, and she concluded by saying, "I think Michelle may have found her calling." Of course, I was sitting on the stairs like, my teacher believes that I could be a writer, and she drove all the way here to tell my family? Because for me, writing was like breathing. You know, I had been reading since I was 3. I read books like crazy all the time. I loved to tell stories. I told stories to my stuffed animals. I told stories to my brothers and sisters. I told them to my nieces and nephews. I was always telling stories. So it just was like somebody, you know, I knew my teacher liked my story, but it was like somebody said, "Good job breathing." I was like, okay. I just accepted it. I never in a million years expected this. And then my dad responded, and he said, "Who are you to tell me about my daughter? Don't you think I know my own daughter better than you? And what kind of a calling is writing anyway? What kind of future will she have? I will not have my daughter poverty-stricken, and I will not have you filling her head with those ideas." I was shocked. My teacher was stunned. I could tell that she never imagined such a reception. And I felt like I had inadvertently done something very wrong. You know, writing, which was such an innate part of me, had been brought to my father's attention, and instead of being happy, he was angry. He was mean. And I felt like suddenly that writing stories must be dangerous, you know? Who knew? It could land you in the poorhouse. So I don't remember what happened after my teacher left. Did my father ever read the story that I wrote? Not to my knowledge. I know that I shared it with my nieces and nephews because years later, even as adults, they told me that of all the stories I told them, that was the one that they loved and remembered the most. But the sad truth is, you know, I wrote poetry and essays and plays, but I never wrote another story again, even after my dad passed away. That is until about 9 years after he died, when I went through what Brené Brown describes as a midlife unraveling. And that's when the universe challenges you to let go of who you thought you were supposed to be and become who you are. And it was then that I began to look back, and I realized that my dad's rejection of creative pursuits came out of his own fears. You know, his fear of uncertainty and of not having enough, his fear of failure, and I think a fear of feeling. And it was my internalization of his disapproval, of his rejection of that part of me, that kept me from telling stories all these years. So eventually I sat down and I wrote my dad 2 letters. In the first, I listed all of the false beliefs and inhibitions that he had passed on to me that I would no longer be keeping. The belief that creativity is dangerous, uncertain, and unsafe. That my voice was not worth hearing, my stories not worth telling. And the even deeper fear that if I told stories, I would somehow be unlovable. And then I lit a fire, and I burned that letter. And I felt ever freer as I watched that smoke go up. And then I wrote him another letter in which I told him that I understood that he had not meant to hurt me, that in his way he was trying to protect me. And I listed all the characteristics he gave me that I would be keeping. His, love of family, his will to succeed, his persistence, his ability to economize, to put the long-term vision ahead of the short-term gain, or as I like to call it, being thrifty. And I told him that I was going to put these characteristics into the service of creativity, that I was going to go out and start writing stories again. And I went to my favorite place on Nantucket, and I buried that letter. I planted it as the symbolic seed of a new beginning, the seed of the story of the rest of my life. And then I went home and I started to write. I wrote every day before work. I wrote for hours on the weekends. I wrote that story that I started when I was 10 into a book called The Dragon of Diamond Hall. And I recorded it as an audio file and shared it with my nieces and nephews, who loved it and told me so, which was very affirming. Felt like I had come full circle. I was a ship that had gone off course. I was finally being righted. And eventually, when my book is published, I plan to dedicate it with love and gratitude and a tiny bit of irony to my father.
Michelle Whalen. Wow, I always sort of say we should have tissues with these shows. Forgive me. Michelle, that was beautiful, really beautiful. And let me tell you a little bit about Michelle. She grew up in northwestern New Jersey. She is the only artist-writer in her family of corporate and technological overachievers, and there were a lot of them. I can't even say it. That's how smart they all are. She studied studio art and English lit at the University of Massachusetts, and while on a break, she visited and fell in love with the island. In 2002, she moved to the island to live here year-round. She's an active visual artist and writer, and she's in the process of publishing her first novel that you just heard about, and she's also working on her second, and aren't we happy about that? She also recently took on the role of Director of Development for the Land Council. Wow. And she is learning to play music with her husband, Avi. I hope I said that correctly, and loves spending time with him and her two amazing daughters, Rowan and Eva, and their rescue chihuahua, Mr. Poppy. Thank you so much, Michelle Whalen. Her story makes me think, as I'm sure many of you, about this idea of parents and their expectations and what we carry. And I was thinking of my own father, who was pretty easygoing on me, to be honest with you. But I still remember the first time I was sort of the good one in our family of four. I always sort of behaved. I was under the radar until a time when I was, I guess, a sophomore in college, and I threw an out-of-control party. I'm proud to say it. I was not that kid, but a completely out-of-control party. People showed up. I grew up in Washington, D.C. People were showing up that I'd never, the place was rocking. My father was away on a business trip. It was all happening until he showed up at the front door because he came back early from the business trip. And the place was covered with people. You can only imagine. It was not a good scene, and I was in shock. And he just looked at me, and he's like, "Bonnie, tell these people to get out of here right now. I'm going to bed." With that, he went upstairs, and he got into bed. Unbeknownst to me, as he's lying in bed, and I'm freakishly trying to get everyone to leave, a man went upstairs, had a little bit too much to drink, and went into my father's bedroom and fell on top of him. My father looked at him and said, "Tell Bonnie to come up here right now." And he climbed up on top of my father, raised his head, and I guess with a lot of beer coming out of his mouth, said, "Who's Bonnie?" And that my father dined out on and tortured me with for the rest of his life. I am proud to say I think I earned his respect finally after suffering hearing that, and now you get to hear it. Anyway, by the way, you have the other slips. I just want to, do you have them all, Denny? The box? Because I thought I'd left them over there. Okay, great. Nope, just good to know, because I want to read some of the, let's hear some more surprises from this audience, shall we? A time you were surprised when our son, now daughter, called to tell us that she is transgender. Incredible. Thank you for sharing that. Tell us about a time you were surprised. When I won the Christmas Eve drawing. Really? I assume it's here, right? It's here? Do you get money? Do you get money? Love that. Okay, I will be here for Christmas Eve next year. Time you were surprised, my dream was to live in Nantucket. And after interviewing for many years, I finally received a call in 2019 that I, quote, got the job. I was overwhelmed, shocked, and above all surprised that it finally happened. I packed my house up, sold it, and have lived here now for 3 years and love it. That's, a lot of the fun for me is, in the summer times when I'm mostly here, it's one thing. But this community in the winter is so special and fantastic, and I feel so privileged to get to know the people of Nantucket in the off-season. It's really great. One more. Tell us about a time you were surprised. When Nathaniel proposed to me. Now, I don't know if Nathaniel's here, but you surprised the person who wrote that. Okay. Are you ready for your next storyteller? Okay. Our next storyteller coming to the stage. When she was 16 years old, an early memory, she was 16 years old. She took the ferry to Nantucket, and it was the slow, or as we all know, the traditional ferry, during a thunderstorm. And all she can remember are the lovely fragrances of vomit and wet dog all over, and the sound of whack, whack, whack. You know that door when the boat lists? It's just, for some reason, can someone deal with that door? Does anyone here have power? It's like the ladies' room bathroom door. It just, and it was terrible, but she came back anyway. Please welcome Sarah Boyce.
That's good. Is that good? Hi. In the winter of 2000 and 2001, I was 23, and I had finally become an adult. Now, I had left my family home at 18, gone to college, lived in many different places other than my parents' home, but I was really close to my family, and I, called my parents regularly for major life decisions, minor life decisions, recipes, what to do about car insurance. I relied on their advice. But in the fall of 2000, I made a decision on my own without consulting anyone. I took a 3-month job in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, working for the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was just an internship, and taking that internship in itself wasn't the big independent decision. It was the fact that I bought a one-way ticket to Wyoming, and I didn't have a plan afterwards. And my parents were a little worried. I'm a planner, or I have been. And I said, no, I got this, because I know what my next step is. Well, I don't actually know what my next step is, but I know it when I see it. And I'm gonna let the Wild West take me, and I'm gonna see what happens, and I'll know what that next step is as soon as it's in front of me. And going to Wyoming and being there was really actually what I needed and all that I thought it would be. So professionally, I was working at the National Elk Wildlife Refuge, one of the first in the refuge systems. And I learned so much about wildlife in the shadow of the Teton Mountains. I learned about elk and bison and how to communicate about science and nature to the public. And I also met some amazing people. Becca was one of my best friends out there. We met at the refuge. And she was a whole year older than me and had gotten to Wyoming about 6 months before me, so she was way ahead of me. And she was kind of that person that I envisioned I could be. She made bold decisions. Any opportunity in front of her, she just grabbed it. She lived, kind of grabbed the bull by the horns. And so she was kind of my guide into how to make my own decisions and make my own way and be bold. And so in addition to professionally, I felt like I learned a lot in Wyoming about just being a grown-up and kind of becoming a woman. I learned how to roll my own cigarettes. I learned how to drink whiskey. I learned how to two-step at the $1 Million Cowboy Bar, if you've ever been. I dated a cowboy, and a real cowboy, not a Gucci cowboy like happens in Jackson a lot. He worked at a ranch outside of town. I learned how to ride a snowmobile and drive a team of horses. And I just really felt like I was coming into my own. And my internship ended, but I bummed around Jackson a little while. I had a couple of odd jobs and house sat. And so by April, I was ready to go back east. And Becca, my good friend, was also from the East Coast. She was from Maryland. And she said, I'll go with you. We'll make an adventure of it. And so instead of buying a plane ticket, I used the money I had to buy a 1985 Honda Prelude, because that was definitely going to get us to the East Coast. And so we packed up the Prelude, and we're ready to have this adventure. We have a minimal plan. And before we go to head east, we of course go west first, because our adventure is going to start in Utah. And on the very first day we leave, we get going pretty well, and we're on our way. And of course, we break down. And I might remind you now that we're in 2001, it's April, and cell phones are not very popular just yet. Not everyone has a cell phone, and we certainly didn't. And even if we did, the middle of Utah desert on the side of the highway, it will certainly not work. And so we had to wait, and we waited, and eventually a state trooper came by and called AAA, or called the tow truck for us. And this is when I'm thinking, gosh, I really should have been calling my parents this whole time, because I hope they paid my AAA. Because, see, all this time that I was having all these experiences and growing up and being bold, I was pulling away from my parents. I had stopped calling as much and stopped sharing as much of my life with them. And so the tow truck comes, and AAA did work. We got towed over 30 miles to the nearest service station, Green River, Utah. And when we get to the service station, I realized this must be the only service station in about a 100-mile radius, because the wall of the service station is covered in photographs of famous people that have all been signed. And the only one I remember to this day is Bill Murray. And I kept thinking, well, okay, if Bill Murray got his car serviced here, then we're gonna be okay. So they diagnose the problem pretty quickly, and they need a part. And we have to wait for a day for the part to come from Salt Lake. So we check into the local motel, we get something to eat. And as we're settling down that evening is when I decided to call my parents. And I was really proud of this moment, because I wasn't calling because I had an emergency and I needed their help. I wasn't calling to say, what should I do? I wasn't calling to ask for money or to be rescued. I had solved my own problem. Well, Becca's calming presence had really helped me solve the problem. If I was alone, I definitely would have called my parents at the first payphone. But just her presence and her guidance was like, we are smart, amazing women. We can totally figure this out. And so when I called my parents that night, I said, you know what, we're good. Everything will be fine. We've got it figured out. And tomorrow morning, everything will be fixed and we'll go back on our adventure. Don't worry. So of course they were worried. Becca called her parents. They were worried too. And we said, you know what, we'll just keep you posted, and then we're gonna head out. It's not a big deal. And so the next day, the part came, the car got fixed, and we were on our way. And we got farther than we got pretty far, and then we broke down again, of course. And then this time, we had just passed a little town. So instead of waiting, we decided to do something about it, because we could make these bright, bold decisions. And so we broke 3 cardinal rules that I'm sure every parent must at some point tell your kids. The first was we ran across 6 lanes of highway traffic. It was like Frogger in the desert, but we made it to the other side. And then we started hitchhiking, because that's the traffic was going back towards town, so we hitchhiked. And then the first thing that stopped for us was a pickup truck. And it was deemed safe because there was a family in the front driving. It was a mom, a dad, and then their little girl between them. But of course, that meant there was no room for us. It was a single bench seat. So they said, we'll bring you to town, but you gotta lay down in the back. And we're like, okay, which seems very ominous to do this. And then we're driving 75 miles an hour back towards town, because it is the West. And I'm thinking, please, I hope my parents never hear about this. But we get to this next service station, and they tow our car back, and it's getting diagnosed, and they find, lo and behold, it's not a big deal. The first service station hadn't installed the alternator correctly, or something like that. Thanks, Bill Murray. And so the car gets fixed pretty quickly. So we're like, great, we're on our way. So we head out. We finally get to Arches National Park. We camp that night. We have an amazing next day. We're on, beautiful red rock desert, wind and water carved rock canyons. We are at, get our photo taken at Delicate Arch. I swear there's photos somewhere. This was before social media and digital things, so, they exist. And so we have this amazing day. And that night, we head over to Canyonlands, because Arches has way too many people at it. And so Canyonlands isn't too far. And we camp at Canyonlands, and our plan is the next day we're gonna do this really difficult hike. So we wake up really early, because the difficult hikes in national parks have the fewest people. And so we drive to the trailhead, and at the trailhead, there's a couple mile hike in this open, flat desert. So it's flat desert, but scrubby brush, but you can see pretty far. So we're walking for a while, and then we get to the edge of the canyon. And this is one of those moments where, you can't quite put words to describe it. And only a painting could do it justice, because a photo certainly can't. You can see what feels like forever. And at the same time, you feel like the most insignificant thing in the world, but you also feel like the awesome power of this huge expanse that we have. And it's this, you can see forever, and we didn't see a single person. And we didn't even see evidence of people. There's no buildings, no signs, no cars. We probably didn't even see a plane. And it's just magical. And so we start hiking down the canyon, switch back. We get to the bottom, and then we're hiking back up the rest of the day. And Becca and I are, among the wildlife, and we're seeing lizards and birds and plants we've never seen before. And it's just amazing. But the other thing is that it's just the two of us, and we don't see any other people. So we're having those philosophical, amazing discussions where, we're talking about the kind of people we want to be and what our next steps are going to be and the kind of people we're going to become and who our partners are going to be, where we want to live. It seems like the world is our oyster, and I can make any decision. I can be anything. I could go anywhere. And it's just like that. The world is right in front of you. I just got chills thinking about that again. So we get back to the edge of the canyon, and we have that hike to go back to where the car is. And as we're going along the end of the day, we see someone coming towards us. So it's shocking, first of all, because we've been on the 17-mile hike and haven't seen a single person, but also it's the end of the day and someone's coming onto the trail, which is a little weird. And then all of a sudden, as I get closer, we see this outline. I'm like, oh, it's a ranger, little hat, Maybe he's a patrol, right, at the end of the day. So he's getting closer. And then we get within shouting distance. And he puts his hand over his mouth, and he says, "Are one of you Sarah?" No last name. And I'm like, what? Oh my God, my car's there. Something happened to the car, and they ran the plate. I'm freaking out. So I'm like, yeah, I'm Sarah, yelling. And he stops again, and he puts his hands to his mouth, and he goes, "Call your mom." And I just stop. I'm like this rolling tumble of emotions. I'm sad and mad and totally embarrassed, and here's cool Becca, and she's my mom can find me anywhere, and I'm in the middle of nowhere in the desert. I've just had the most amazing day of my life. I've had this epiphany, and my mom is can find me and tells me what to do still. And so we have to finish walking another half mile to the car. And then we get to the car, and we have to drive to the visitor center, because remember, there's no cell phones. And then we have to find a payphone. So in this whole time, Becca really talks me off the ledge. she's like, something may have happened. They're trying to find you. Maybe something terrible happened to your family, or not. Or, maybe they're just worried about us. And that's when I remember we haven't called. It's been 2.5, maybe 3 days since we talked to our parents. And the last time they talked to us, we were in a motel in Green River, Utah, and our car was broken down. They might be worried. So I've kind of tempered myself a bit by the time I get to the payphone, and I call my mom, and I hear the hitch in her voice as she starts to cry when she hears me. And all the anger melts away, and she says, and I just say, I'm okay, and I'm sorry. And then we learn that in the preceding 48 hours, not only had our parents been looking for us, but everyone had been looking for us. Everyone within a 2.5-day drive from Green River, Utah. So my mom had gotten worried and called Becca's dad because we had given them their numbers. Becca's dad happens to be a state trooper in Maryland. And they both, talking together, said, oh, our girls are such responsible young ladies. If they said they were going to call, they would have called. Something is wrong. And so they called Green River, Utah, and found the one service station. And they said, oh, yeah, those girls left days ago. And so they called out an APB, an all points bulletin, where all law enforcement was literally looking for us. My mom has no authority, so she called a prayer circle, and relatives I've never even met were praying for our safety. And so, embarrassed this time for a different reason. We learned, or I learned, a valuable lesson, that at 23, it was still important to call the people who loved me. It didn't mean that I couldn't make my own decisions or that I wasn't an independent young woman. It meant that I had people who loved me, who cared about me and worried. And I shouldn't take that for granted. And so, eventually Becca and I did make it east, she to Maryland and me eventually to Nantucket. And in all my adventures since, I have remembered mostly to call my family. And now, especially that I'm a mother myself, I often think about the worry that I put her through and that I still put her through to this day. And I, remember the valuable lesson of to always call home. Thank you.
Sarah Boyce. Is her mother in the theater? We'd like to know. We'd like to hear from her. Oh, Sarah, that was amazing. Sarah is the Director of Research and Education at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, right here in Nantucket, and she loves to write about science and nature and is now working on telling her own stories, and I think she's doing a pretty darn good job, don't you? Yeah. Well done. That's amazing, and hold on for a second. Probably should have a table out here. It made me think about, I am old enough, as maybe some of you remember when we had to call collect home. No cell phones, and it was always that every Sunday night at 6 o'clock, I would call my mother, and it's so touching to hear this and what you know now. I talked about these changes and what we learn when we tell wonderful stories, and for me, it really reminded me of the fact that the last words both my parents shared with me when they were dying, the last words they ever said to me were, "Are you okay?" And they died at different times, but both of them did it. And I thought, my God, that you never stop worrying about your children, no matter how okay they are. And what a reminder that is. So let's all call our parents, shall we? Yeah. So a couple more of these. Tell us about a time that you were surprised. This is so true. I felt the same way when there was no parking on Main Street in February. What? And this is a good one. Taxes. Just taxes. That's a time I was always surprised. Time I was surprised when I finally found the shipwreck on the South Shore. Now, he's put his name here. Wait, he found the shipwreck? Okay. Well, we'll have to talk to you, Tom, afterwards, whoever you are. Couple of more. When my son was born, I was so sure he would be a she. That definitely happens to us all. I was surprised when I accidentally met Paul McCartney. Okay, name dropping does happen here, because I unknowingly made friends with his daughter at an after-hours party. That's pretty cool. We love Paul McCartney. Come on, I mean, he is the Beatle that just keeps on keeping on. Okay, are you ready for your next storyteller? Okay. Our next storyteller, an early memory of Nantucket for her, was walking to the Washington Street beach. She was 5 years old, and she was with her best friend, David Rose. I don't know, David, if you're here, and just stopping by Amy's Bakery. Does anybody have a memory of Amy's Bakery? Please welcome MJ Moser. Is that a little better?
In 1995, way back in the last century, I chaperoned my daughter's 5th grade class trip to Washington, D.C. I hadn't really explored the city before, and to get to do that with my daughter, her friends, classmates, and the other chaperones was really something so special. We saw monuments and memorials. We went to Arlington National Cemetery. We had a tour of the White House, which for some reason included sliced cake. So that was really great. The whole thing was a really incredible adventure. The only part I really didn't like about it was the flying part. I'd always been a hesitant flyer at best. It really wasn't my favorite thing. And I think that if you could ever find any of the old Air New England planes, you would clearly see my fingertips permanently embedded in the headrests for many of the flights. And it's not that the flights were necessarily bad flights, they were just flights on planes. And that was not in my comfort zone. For this particular trip on our way back, we boarded the plane in DC, sat at the gate for an hour, got off the plane still in DC, and then had to wait for 2 or 3 hours while they identified and then repaired whatever mechanical issue it was that kept us from flying back. And for a lot of people, that may not be a problem. They found it, they fixed it, we flew, no big deal. For me, it felt like a huge deal. And the longer I sat there, the more nervous I got, the more nauseous I got, the more anxious I got, the more frightened I became. When we finally boarded the plane and got back to Boston, when we stepped off the plane, I knew that I wouldn't be flying again anytime soon. What had always been a cause for anxiety or discomfort had blossomed into this full-blown phobia. And it felt like it moved in, and I slammed the door behind it. For years, I was fine, or I told myself I was fine. I didn't really need to fly anywhere anyway. I could take a boat or a bus or a train, or we could drive anywhere. California, I could drive to. Europe, with all that great food and history, who needs that? I was fine where I was, and that's what I kept telling myself. The only problem was that as my kids were growing, and as their lives were growing, mine was shrinking. And we were missing out on all of those amazing adventures. When my son Jake moved to Arizona to go to school, I didn't go out there with him. I didn't help him set up his first apartment. I didn't help him find the best coffee shop or a good grocery store or see his neighborhood. And I didn't do any of those things because I was too scared to get on a plane. When my daughter Mariah moved to Scotland, I didn't go out and visit her. We didn't hike the Highlands or sit and drink tea or try haggis, so maybe I didn't miss out on a lot of things, but some things I did. And I didn't do any of those things because I was too scared to get on a plane. When she was there, I almost had myself convinced that I could do it. I'm a grown-up, I can put on my big girl pants, I can get on that plane, I can get to Scotland, and then I thought, yes, but What if you get there and you're too scared to get back on the plane to come home? You live in Scotland the rest of your life, which really sounds kind of wonderful, but really wasn't in the cards for me at that point. I knew that at some point I'd need to deal with this, but I had closed that door so tightly, and it felt so much larger than my ability to try and deal with it, so I just didn't for a long time. A few years later, my daughter got married, and she and her husband, who was in the Army, moved to Washington State. And I thought, that is not a problem. I can drive to Washington State. Or we can take a train to Washington State, because what would be better than taking a train 3,000 miles across the country, and we could meet them for lunch and then, get on the train and come right back. But what a great trip that will be. But then a few months later, she called and said, "Hey, Mom, I'm pregnant with my first grandchild." Talk about an amazing adventure. I called a therapist and I made my first appointment, and I thought, I'm going to get in there. She is going to take one look at me and listen to my story and say, yeah, you probably should never fly again. But that's not what happened. She actually said, actually flying is the safest form of travel, so let's figure out how to get you on a plane. I thought, well, good luck to you, lady. I am committed to this fear. The first couple of sessions were really about getting to know each other, building that trust and that bond that you need when you have hard work to do. On maybe the third session, she said, let's talk about that first time you felt fear on a plane. Your first time you felt fear of flying. And I said, well, I was afraid to fly before I ever stepped on a plane. And she said, why do you think that was? I said, well, when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, it was April, the herring were running. My dad and I were out fishing Matticat Road at the bridge, and we dropped our nets in. I was always the kid that fell in the water, but that's another story. While we were standing there, we heard a plane flying over really low and really loud. And we looked up and we could see smoke pouring out the back, and we could see flames. We jumped in the Jeep and we drove to Matticat Beach. We couldn't see anything, of course, but we could hear sirens by this time, so we knew help was on the way. We found out the next day that it was a Navy plane that had flown over. There were more than 12 or 14 people on board, and there was one survivor. When I told the therapist that story, instead of saying, oh my goodness, or that must be terrifying, or, oh, how did you live through that? All she said was, okay, let's get to work. And in that moment, I felt that door that I had closed so tightly crack open just the tiniest bit. Not enough to feel hope, but enough to feel as though there might maybe be a possibility that I could maybe someday think about walking into an airport. So we did get to work. I saw her every week for about 3 months, and we started off slowly. The good thing about having no comfort zone when it came to flying is that we built one from the ground up. At first, we talked about what it would be like to walk into the airport, what time I'd like to get there before my flight. Anyone that knows me would mean that would be ridiculously early. What I would like to bring with me. Do I want to bring music or a book or both? Where would I like my seat to be on the plane? Do I want an aisle seat? Do I want a window seat? And over the course of weeks, the conversation turned from if you could get on a plane to when you get on the plane to when you fly out to see your daughter. And each week that door would open just a bit more. I didn't need it to fly wide open. I just needed to be able to squeeze through it. At what wound up being our last session together, she said, okay, today we're going to talk about when you land in Seattle, what that will be like. The plane has landed, you've taxied up to the gate, they taken off the seatbelt sign, what do you do now? I said, okay. I unfasten my seatbelt, I gather up my belongings, I walk off the plane, and I see my daughter as a mother for the first time. I hold my grandson, Abe. We go to my daughter's house, we sit at her table, we drink tea, we adventure, we travel around, we have an incredible adventure. And she said, okay, on the trip back, Said the trip back is easy because I'll be busy looking at all the pictures of my daughter and my grandson. Did I mention I'll be holding Abe a lot of the time? And she said, yeah, I think you mentioned that. She said, but now it's time to buy your ticket. And I said, I don't understand. And she said, you've seen yourself as getting there safely and successfully and getting home safely and successfully. It's time to buy your ticket. About 3 weeks later, my husband and I were on a plane from Boston to Seattle. And I would love to tell you that I was the picture of calm, that I was laid back and easy, and I was comfortable and happy, but I was mostly passed out and drooling because Ativan and wine are a very potent combination. So the trip out there I don't remember a lot of. The trip back, however, was better, but my daughter was waiting. We did have an incredible adventure. On the trip back, I was actually aware that I was flying, so that's a step in the right direction. I have flown so many times since that day. I've had some great flights. I've had a couple of scary flights, but not too bad. In 2 weeks and 2 days, I'll be getting back on a plane. This time I'll be flying to Delhi, India, where I'll be seeing my daughter when I get off the plane. I'll see 4 of my now 10 grandchildren. I'll spend time with them. I'll spend time with my daughter. We'll go on adventures. And as for Abe, the one that sort of started this whole thing, he's now almost 14, and I will get to watch him in his first lead role in a high school play as Shrek in Shrek the Musical. And I can't wait to fasten my seatbelt. Thank you.
Mary Jane Moser. Oh, that was just so good. Excuse me, I'm going to adjust this again. Here we go. I'm sure many of you know Mary Jane, but she is fiercely proud of her Nantucket heritage, and she loves that at almost 63, she's still referred to as a Perry girl. She also has several thousand frequent flyer miles and plans on using every one and more. So, again, for MJ Moser. I love that story, and I'm sure many of us can relate to a little bit of a fear of flying at the very least. And I have shared this before with some of you, but I feel that after MJ's story, it's worth sharing again, because my fear of flying was challenged on Nantucket, leaving Nantucket about 20 years ago. I was in a small charter plane that somebody had chartered. I was a guest on it. There was 2 of us, and we were going to the Westchester Airport, so not a long flight. And I referred to the plane as Old Yeller. Their duct tape was involved. The pilot was not quite through puberty, but alive and with a pulse. And we go up in the air, and I'm very nervous, but it's a beautiful day, and we're flying along, and it's just wonderful. And I'm calming down. But then out our right window, you see in the rear comes another plane, a very small plane. And it gets closer and closer, and we tap the pilot, and we say, and he just turns around and goes, and okay, because as the pilot should know if we're in trouble. And this plane basically gets so close to us for the second half of our trip that I can see the eyeballs of the 2 pilots. And the lovely woman, Leslie, and I are in tears because we think we're going to die midair. And this plane, I don't know if you remember Snoopy and the Red Baron, this thing, it follows us all the way. We're sobbing. We finally make our turn to go into Westchester, and the pilot turns around to say we're landing, and we realize for the first time he sees this plane, and the fear in his eyes is terrifying. And we are in tears. We make it. We land in Westchester. The other plane lands beside us and keeps going. The door opens, and our pilot just leaps out and runs on the tarmac after the plane. And we're just sitting there going, what? And we're just sitting there with our seatbelts on, the pilot's gone. And finally, the service people come in and get us out of the plane and tell us what happened, which is The plane behind us was a drug dealer who had come from Canada and had been caught on radar by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and they hid under our radar blip. And that is why they were so close to us. So, not to bring back your fear of flying, but don't do drugs. That is my message. It's been fine ever since. I'm barely okay. Thank God for her story. A time you were surprised. When I moved that planter that I had brought into the basement and found a nest of baby snakes under it. I was surprised when I spontaneously got a dog after my whole life saying I didn't like dogs. I bet this dog changed your life in a beautiful, beautiful way. We're just going to go with that. We're hoping that this dog is a wonderful dog. Okay, are you ready for your next storyteller? Yes. Okay, our next storyteller, an early memory for him was he was just coming for the day to Nantucket, as one does after Hurricane Bob, or during early, sort of around it. This is the early 90s, if any of you remember that hurricane. I sure do. He stopped for breakfast, and there was a big sign, and I love that this is his early memory. And I quote, "Due to Hurricane Bob, there are no muffins." I love that that is an early Nantucket memory. Please welcome Don Picard.
There we go. Hey. So you know how in grade school there's always that one kid who's like super weird and doesn't wear the right clothes and doesn't say the right things and doesn't know the right things and like doesn't even talk about sports. I know this is going to be shocking. I was that kid. My parents sent me and my 4 siblings to this same private Catholic grade school that was associated with our church because that way we would get a better education. Maybe. You know, I think it really for them had more to do with discipline than education because my textbooks actually did say things like, and someday man may land on the moon. Even though there were 5 of us in total, as a family, we're actually pretty spread apart. Like my eldest brother was already graduated by the time I entered, and so my older brother, Mark, he was like in like 6th and 7th grade as I'm first coming up through like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And we didn't really interact. And I do remember the time when in 3rd grade, the 7th graders some of the 7th graders had done something wrong. And their punishment was that they were sent to the 3rd grade where Sister Irene Gerard, our teacher, she was about 5 feet, maybe, but she was terrifying. And they had to just stand on the sides while we, the 3rd graders, sat, and there was my brother. It was a scandal. And so even though I had family there and there were people from the community there, I just felt very alone. I was like, there wasn't anyone that I really felt particularly connected with. It's not like I had a fast friend to share it with. And I was also a very little kid. I mean, I know I'm not little now, but I was then. And inside I still am, but you can't see that. And so when you're just like not physically imposing and you're this weird one, it's pretty easy to be singled out. And I was. There were boys that pretty quickly decided that I was the one they could pick on. Like these days we would call it bullying, but back then we didn't use those words. And it was usually verbal harassment, which I could deal with. But it was even sometimes physical. I remember this one time in 8th grade, Robbie Hines was behind me and he was walking up to the front of the class and he just punched me, like out of nowhere, just wailed on me. And I was confused, and I just started to cry. And I think it's not like it hurt so much that I was crying. It was just so devaluing. Like I just didn't matter to him. Like he could hit me in front of the teacher and nothing would happen. And I'm sure he was sent down to the principal's office and had a stern reprimand. But I was taken out into the hallway by Mr. Suzuki, our 8th grade teacher, and he told me that I needed to start fighting back. So that was great advice. And it wasn't just the boys. Like, I know it's not a common term, but there were alpha females in my classroom. Like Pam and Judy Sirocco. Judy Sirocco, at the end of 6th grade, like we are signing each other's report cards, with things like, have a great summer or see you next fall, like the kinds of things you do. These are people from my church. I'd see them on Sunday. But Judy just wrote, "fag!" ! Like that was it. That was her signature line to me at the end of 6th grade. I didn't even know what it meant, but it definitely, the exclamation mark made it sound like it probably wasn't supposed to be a celebration. And I got good at running. I got good at running because, like Bobby or Jimmy or Danny McCurry, like they would chase me during recess. Like it was just like a fun thing to do. Like they wouldn't do it together. It wasn't like they would gang up on me, but one of them often would decide to just like start running around chasing me on the playground. I called it playground. It was just the church parking lot. It was just hot top. There were like 3 swings over like the far end, but like that was it. Everything else was from our imagination. And there were some organized activities. We did. There were times we were playing ball. I wasn't good at sports. I just wasn't. I always thought it was just because I just didn't have the ability to do it. I was always in awe of these kids that could like catch a baseball. That just whenever I caught something, it seemed like it was a miracle. And I just, okay, well, I'm just not good at sports. Like that was just this thing that I heard and I believed. I found out later, it's because I couldn't see. I mean, I knew that I couldn't see then. Like I wore glasses, but my family didn't have much money, and I must have worn or broken them a lot when I was very little. So by the time I got to grade school, they were only to be used if I needed to see the blackboard, or strangely, if I'm home, I had to use them while I was watching TV. That was it. Every other time they need to be, stowed away. And I hated wearing glasses. It was just like one more thing. So I was happy to only use them at these prescribed times. But in sort of when I was becoming a young adult, I got contact lenses. And that was the first time that I had actually had corrected vision while standing outside. And it turns out that you can actually see leaves on trees and blades of grass. Like they're not just these green blobs. So yeah. And so maybe it wasn't quite so magical. Maybe if I just had worn the right lenses, I maybe could have learned how to catch a baseball. But so I was always the last person picked on any team at grade school. Like I was always the last. Unless it was dodgeball, then I was the first that would get hit. But this was just life for me. Like, and I didn't want to be like celebrated. I just wanted to be left alone. I just wanted to be able to be, like, just to not be targeted. But I just couldn't figure out how to do that. I would just lie low, if I just don't say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or act the wrong way, like maybe it'll just, I could just like slide by and it'll be okay. And then one day, Danny was chasing me and I was outrunning him. Like I'd gotten good at this point. And he said, Picard, there's going to be this track and field day. You should enter the 100-yard dash. You're really fast. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't really know what a track and field day was, but I liked the idea that I could enter a race and win it. Like, that sounded good. And it really, to this day, I really do think Danny was being sincere. Like, it was like, I did run faster than he did. And, he was way more popular and athletic than I was. So, maybe it's something I could do. And maybe if I did it, like, I don't have to win, but like, maybe if I just don't come in last, maybe that would help calm things. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. I told my gym teacher that I wanted to do this thing. And he said, great. And he said, don't forget, you need to bring your running clothes. I said, okay. He said, because we wore school uniforms. For 8 years, I had to wear the same gray pants and white shirt and green clip-on tie. Sure. It was easier. And a green blazer. And it took me lots of therapy before I could wear green again. And so that's not something one wears in a race. And so I would bring the clothes to school and change at school. It would all be fine. My school didn't have lockers. So we had to change in the boys' bathroom. And I grew up in a hyper-Catholic family. None of us ever saw any of us naked. Like, that just didn't happen. Even seeing each other in underwear was weird. And so I just walked into the first stall and I started changing into my lucky pants and lucky shirt. And I knew to bring sneakers because running in my dress shoes is not something I would want to do, even though that's what we had to run when we were actually on the playground. We didn't have to wear the blazer, but we did have to run in our dress clothes. And I could hear the boys outside, and I heard one of them say, "Who's in the stall?" And somebody else kind of disgustingly said, "Picard." My lucky pants were, my favorite pants were actually corduroys, but I knew not to wear those. So my lucky pants we're gonna go with salmon colored. And even though this was late June, these were not shorts. They were long pants, and they had blue and yellow pinstripes. If they had been billowy, it would have been accurate to call them clown pants. But this was the 1970s. They were tight. And so that's what I came out of the stall wearing, my lucky pants and my shirt. And no one said anything. To the best of my recollection, it was just like, I guess it just thought, yeah, that adds up. And so we got on the bus and we went to Painters Park, which was on the other side of town. So it wasn't really a park I was familiar with. And I'm sitting in the bleachers with my classmates, and I am so thirsty. It is so hot, and I'm perspiring, and I'm just waiting for my race to be called. And other kids, like, their parents were there. And, it was not a thing I even thought was a possibility. It didn't even occur to me to mention to my parents that I was doing this race thing, because, my family didn't do organized sports. That was just not part of our culture. But, Mrs. Malone was there, and she had a cooler, and there was water in the cooler. And I just kept waiting for her to ask me if I would like some water, and waiting. And I also noticed that there were kids on the benches that were getting up at various times and going off and doing their thing and then coming back. And I just sat there waiting for my race and sat there, and I just became more parched and more bored. And at 5 o'clock, it was wrapping up. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if my race just didn't happen, or the much more likely thing that since I had no idea what this was, I kept thinking an adult would just come and find me and say, "Hey, it's time for your race." And so the most likely thing is the race happened without me. So I didn't win. I didn't even run. And another parent just asked me if I wanted a ride home, and I said, okay. And I got the ride home. And I went through 8 years of that. And I was so glad to finally be able to put it behind and go to high school, because to be one of 20, okay, but then now I'll be one of 300. And in high school, I actually did find someone who was like me, just another weirdo. and we were friends, we were good friends, but the physical abuse stopped. The verbal abuse, not so much. We were just friends. We would study together and hang out together and play Dungeons and Dragons together. But like, in math class, one of the other students would often start singing Strangers in the Night, like when we were there before class would begin. It always just felt like my crime was that I was different. And I didn't know what to do about that. I wasn't going to be somebody else. It did get better. It got better in college. I finally did find a bunch of other people. And for some weird reason, in college at least, it seems as though being different was no longer such a horrible thing. And I had friends that were like me and friends that weren't like me. And that was all good. And it probably took me about a decade, about a decade after those incidents at the end of grade school, to finally, realize that I needed to start talking. Like I really needed to be able to talk and have people hear me, because that whole time when I was basically trying not to be seen, no one's ever going to get to know you that way. And if you want to matter, you need to be seen. Thank you.
Don Picard. I think it's fair to say we see you, Don. We see you, and we're very happy that we do. Don's worked in the Boston area for 30 years as a software developer. He was a double major in theater arts and computer science at Cornell University, and chose to work as an engineer in order to be able to live in Cambridge and feed his family. He enjoys telling live stories about his kids, husband, and extended family, as it is fun, therapeutic, and allows him to exercise the other half of his college degree so he doesn't become bitter, which I love. Oh, that was awesome. Another round of applause for Don. It's such a reminder, how many of us would want to relive those awkward years. I don't think it would be the years that I would, I'm sure all of you were remembering as I was sort of thinking, I felt like such a weirdo. I was this tall at 12, and it was awful. And I joke about the fact that at school dances, the boys were up to here, and I looked like I was breastfeeding. It was just horrendous. And I also shared the story. I went to an all-girls religious school. Somehow, it's funny how our similar playground, actually, the parking lot. But we did have a small gymnasium, and they forced me to play basketball, but I was terrible at it. But I did have an important job, because before every game, they made me get up and walk slowly around the gym to frighten the other team. That was my job on the team. So those years, I am sure we could go around this audience and have our lovely early school memories. Okay, a couple of times you were surprised. Our daughter decided she was ready to join us 5 weeks early. Aha, early birth. We were flown by Coast Guard helicopter up to Boston. That's pretty la-di-da. She was as healthy as could be and ready to join the party. Thank goodness. We love the Coast Guard, don't we? Oh my goodness. Time you were surprised. I was 10. It was Christmas. I got a pony. His name was Skedaddle. Oh, how great is that? That's magic. I love that. Okay, our final storyteller. Have you guys been having a great time? Yeah. How great are these storytellers? Okay, our final storyteller, her earliest memory, before she moved here, she would come up here to camp at a friend's property near Dionis. How great is that? And that, as she said, was a very long time ago when you could do that. But she and her cousins and siblings got to sleep on the beach, and they would swim with the phosphorescent fish. What a gorgeous memory. Please welcome Francesca Soubet.
Good evening. I don't know about you, but it's really cold in here. All right. My cell phone buzzes. It's my daughter, Greer, who lives here on the island year-round. Hi, Mom. There's a waver in her voice, a catch in the O of Mom. I know something is wrong. I remember when Greer was 10 years old and she broke her leg playing at a friend's house. I went over to the house to pick her up. And as I'm walking in the door, she yells, "Mom, I need you to be brave." She's reminding me because when she was 6 years old and I saw a huge gash in her back, I forgot to be brave. I did not hold up to that great expectation that mothers are held to, which is to be cool no matter what, and put on a nice smile and say, as if we're going to Disneyland, "Let's go to the hospital." I forgot to do that. So Greer was reminding me of what she needed, to be brave, and I was. Even when I saw the cracked bone, the swelling that was keeping that bone from pushing through her skin, I followed Greer's lead and I put on my best tight smile and said, "Looks like we're going to the hospital." Now with Greer on the phone, I can hear the fear in her breathing. Prayers instantly skip across my heart. Greer is not quite 7 months pregnant, and she has had a few hiccups in her pregnancy. Her words come out in a slow motion tumble. My heart is pounding. "Mom, I'm in the hospital. I woke up early this morning and I was leaking something that isn't urine. It's amniotic fluid, so I am here." And then she utters the mommy's mantra, "Everything is fine." It is Christmas Eve. Greer's daughter is not supposed to arrive until mid-March. I remember when Greer was 10 and she was in the hospital with her broken leg, she had a lot of questions. And she demanded that the doctor talk to her, "Not me, it's my leg." And the doctor was impressed and amused by Greer's insistence. I too was impressed and started to take notes. How to be brave, how to take care, lessons I was learning from my 10-year-old daughter. And now, with Greer on the phone, I ask her questions. Questions I know she has the answer to, but I wanted her to know that she was doing everything she could. Every answer gave her something that she could hold on to, a kind of weaving out of a long rope that she could tether herself to, she at one end, her daughter at the other. They're going to medvac Greer off the island as soon as it stops snowing. When Greer was in the hospital and we were waiting for them to set the leg, I nuzzled in her ear, "You are so brave." And she put her little arm around my neck and said, "Thank you for showing me how." I tickled her with butterfly kisses and thought, "Thank you for reminding me." It is Christmas morning. Greer is at Mass General Hospital in Boston, and so is her daughter. She came to us 10 weeks early, small, Not even 3 pounds, but strong. Prayers. I am whispering, please, as I pack my bag, please let them be all right, let them be strong, let them be healthy, please. As I make the 18-hour drive from Chicago to Boston, it is the winter of 2021. COVID is rampant. It is a holiday. There is no flying. I am driving. And as I drive, I create pictures of the future of Greer and her daughter. I watch them make crowns of daffodils and daisies together, leave food out for the fairies, make wishes on a slipper of a moon, please. I get to Boston. I walk into the hospital room, and Greer collapses in my arms, just like when she was 10 years old and wanted me to hold this hurt. Take this fear, hold this until my heart stops pounding. And I do what mothers are expected to do. I hold Greer's fear so she can get all the answers to all the questions. How? Why? What then? Greer makes sure her daughter will be strong by naming her Willa, which means protect. Then both Greer and I come down with COVID, and we have to isolate for 10 days. For 10 days, Greer is not allowed to see Willa. For 10 days, Greer has to turn over all the care to the experts. I sit with Greer while she sobs out her fear, swallowing my own, vigilant with pleas, grateful for every thank you. Then Greer is told that Willa is going to need minor heart surgery to repair a hole that often happens when you are a premature baby. I thought Greer's own heart would crack with the news. And then there was a collapse of exhaustion, that place where fear can move in and settle. I tug at the rope that tethers me to Greer and remind her, as she once reminded me, be brave. Greer takes a big, deep breath, pulls herself together, and then does what mothers are expected to do. She holds Willa in her heart so the doctors can repair Willa's heart. And then for the next few months, Greer holds Willa's fears as she faces complications that can happen when you come into this world so very tiny. All the while, Greer speaks to her daughter in the voice of a mother, quiet, strong. It's okay. Everything is fine. I marvel at Greer's strength. But then remember, I made sure my daughter would be strong by naming her Greer, which means courage. I would often look back at that moment as a young mother when I did not hold up to that expectation and forgot to be brave. But watching Greer navigate through those first few months with Willa and remembering the lessons that I learned when Greer was 10 years old, I realize that the expectation isn't so much to be so brave that no one can see the cracks, but to keep fighting despite the cracks. And as for Willa, we celebrated her first birthday this past Christmas. She is catching up to the milestones and passing others. She will beam her oh so happy to be here smile at anyone who looks her way, reminding everyone that her days of joy and wonder are for all of us. These are the lessons I am learning from my granddaughter.
Francesca Subre. Beautiful. Oh, Francesca grew up on Nantucket, but transplanted to the Midwest about 30 years ago, and she's presently living in Chicago. She's an actor, director, teacher, and wonderful storyteller. She's been telling stories wherever she can, and she's a 4-time Moth Slam winner. Wow. Francesca is thrilled to be on the island, the place that has always been home in her heart. And I would like to say, with that beautiful story, what a way to end our night. I want to thank you all, and her theme of being brave, I think applies to all of our storytellers. They were very brave, and I'd like to bring them all up. You guys could come up and take a bow. Come on up, take a bow. Thank you all. Have a lovely night.